Imagine wars sweeping across continents, armies clashing, empires trembling. Yet some of the most powerful people in history never fired a single shot. They didn't march into battle. They didn't sign treaties on the battlefield. And yet, they controlled the outcome of wars, shaped empires, and dictated the flow of unimaginable wealth. Who were these people? Secret families who financed kings, empires, and revolutions, hidden puppeteers of history's deadliest conflicts. Some of the world's most iconic wars were not won by swords, but by ledgers, loans, and strategic financial influence. Today, we uncover the untold story of how a handful of wealthy families quietly controlled the fate of nations without ever drawing a weapon. Welcome to Phenigma, where we decode the systems behind global money and power. To understand this power, we travel back to Renaissance Europe. While kings and generals made headlines, the real control of empires often lay in the banking halls of Florence, Venice, and Augsburg. Families like the Fuggers, the Medicis, and the Welsers weren't just wealthy traders, they were financiers whose money dictated the rise and fall of nations. Take the Fugger family from Augsburg, Germany. By the early 1500s, they had become the richest banking dynasty in Europe, lending enormous sums to monarchs, including Emperor Charles V, helping him secure his position as Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. Wars, coronations, and political alliances all depended on their capital. Need an army? Borrow from the Fuggers. Want a king crowned? They could fund it. But they didn't just earn interest, they influenced political decisions, shaped alliances, and ensured that wars benefited their financial interests. For the Fuggers, every battle was a financial opportunity. Wars weren't just fought on the battlefield, they were engineered in the ledgers of bankers. The principle was simple: control the money, and you control the war. Armies march only if the gold flows, and the Fuggers ensured it did, but always in a way that increased their wealth and power. Empires may have fought battles, but the Fuggers were winning from the shadows, never holding a sword themselves. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the world was changing at a breathtaking pace. While kings fought battles with swords and cannons, financial powerhouses were quietly rewriting the rules of war and empire. The Medici family of Florence had already established themselves as masters of banking and politics, funding ambitious rulers while maintaining incredible influence over the Vatican and European courts. Through shrewd loans and political alliances, the Medici didn't just profit, they shaped decisions that would alter the course of history. Across Germany, the Welsers were carving out their own legacy. Not content with banking alone, they engaged in colonial trade, managing entire territories in the Americas, and financing European conflicts. Wars, they realized, were profitable if you knew how to fund them strategically. Their wealth and influence allowed them to dictate the flow of goods, armies, and ultimately, the outcomes of battles, all without ever sending a soldier to the front lines. By the 18th century, a new player arrived on the European stage, the Rothschild family. Originating in Frankfurt, this dynasty would soon redefine the concept of global finance. Nathan Mayer Rothschild's legendary network of couriers, messengers, and financial instruments allowed him to move information and capital faster than any army could march. During the Napoleonic Wars, Rothschild was not on the battlefield, yet he knew about victories, defeats, and troop movements before even kings could. By leveraging this knowledge, he orchestrated loans, bond trades, and credit systems that enriched his family and solidified their dominance over Europe's financial landscape. Consider the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. While cannon fire and cavalry charges decided the immediate outcome, Nathan Rothschild had already positioned his assets strategically, profiting massively from market movements that followed the battle's result. The lesson: financial foresight could outperform battlefield bravery. Meanwhile, across oceans, finance was quietly shaping colonial ambitions. European powers often relied on private families and merchant banks to fund expeditions, armies, and even entire governments. In some cases, these financiers demanded political influence in return. Wars became instruments of wealth creation for a select few. Every loan carried leverage. Every credit extension created dependency. Monarchs needed bankers more than bankers needed monarchs. In essence, the true power lay with those controlling the money, not the armies. Even smaller wars, rebellions, or revolutions bore the fingerprints of these families. The Rothschilds, Fuggers, and Medicis understood that chaos on the battlefield could be predictable if you controlled the purse strings. Need a rebellion suppressed? Fund the opposing forces strategically. Want to gain influence in a distant colony? Finance its governor. Across centuries, this invisible network of money and influence became the real engine behind some of the most pivotal events in world history. But their influence wasn't limited to war. It shaped economies, industries, and entire nations. By controlling credit and capital, these families dictated which industries thrived, which cities prospered, and which nations fell into debt. For example, during the industrial revolutions of the 19th century, families like the Rothschilds and Fuggers financed railroads, mining operations, and steel production, ensuring that economic power and military capability were intertwined. Armies needed weapons, weapons needed steel, steel needed capital, and capital was controlled by a handful of private dynasties. It wasn't just Europe. Across the Atlantic, similar dynamics played out. Wealthy financiers in London and Amsterdam funded the colonies and the transatlantic trade. Wars, territorial disputes, and colonial administration were all deeply tied to the flow of capital. Private banks, much like modern hedge funds, acted as intermediaries between governments and armies. The lesson remained consistent: control the capital, and you control the world. By the mid-19th century, the concept of industrialized warfare emerged. Factories producing weapons, ships, and artillery became as important as soldiers on the battlefield. Families who controlled these industries and the credit behind them effectively had a say in how wars were fought, who was equipped, and who ultimately won. Industrialists like the Krupps in Germany and Vickers in England exemplified this shift. Their wealth was inseparable from global military power. Wars were not just political, they were economic engines, and the architects were often invisible to the public. This hidden world of financial influence is not theory, it's history. The Fuggers loans influenced European imperial campaigns. The Rothschilds bonds funded armies and reshaped governments. The Medicis wealth stabilized or toppled political factions in Renaissance Italy. They understood a simple principle: power and money could achieve what armies often could not. And through centuries, these lessons remain relevant today. Modern defense contracts, military-industrial complexes, and international lending systems all echo the same strategies. The architecture of wealth and war, carefully hidden from the public eye, continues to shape global power. As we study these families, one thing becomes clear: empires rise and fall not solely on bravery or strategy, but on capital, leverage, and the foresight to see beyond the battlefield. Those who understood money understood power. And those who controlled the flow of money controlled the fate of nations. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world had entered a new era of conflict, technology, and global finance. Wars were no longer fought only with swords, cannons, or cavalry. Industrialization had changed the battlefield, and with it, the role of money had become more crucial than ever. Families and financial networks that had quietly shaped European history now extended their influence into global conflicts, and their strategies still echo in the modern financial and military systems we see today. The Rothschilds, who had already dominated European finance for centuries, became central figures in funding governments during the Napoleonic aftermath and throughout the 19th century. By the early 1900s, their reach was global. They financed infrastructure, trade, and even governments, creating a web of economic dependencies that gave them leverage over nations before a single bullet was fired. While soldiers marched and empires expanded, these financiers moved wealth across borders faster than any army could. Their intelligence networks anticipated political moves, revolutions, and market shifts, allowing them to act decisively while nations were still reacting. World War I exemplifies the culmination of centuries of financial influence. J.P. Morgan and Co., in collaboration with European banks including Rothschild branches, arranged over $3 billion in loans to allied powers. To put this in perspective, this wasn't just financial assistance, it was the lifeline that enabled armies to mobilize, factories to produce, and empires to continue fighting. The line between finance and military strategy blurred completely. The banks effectively controlled the flow of war resources, shaping both the tactics on the battlefield and the economic survival of nations. During this time, industrial families like Krupp in Germany and Vickers in Britain became indispensable to war efforts. Krupp steel and artillery production determined not just Germany's military power, but also its economic standing in Europe. Vickers did the same for Britain. The lesson was clear: controlling production and capital meant controlling war outcomes. Money, industry, and strategy were inseparable, more powerful than armies in some cases. World War II took this dynamic to a global scale. Defense contracts, war production, and international lending systems were all heavily influenced by financial networks. The Rothschilds, Morgans, and other banking dynasties had less direct control over the battlefield, but immense power over supply chains, credit lines, and national economies. Nations reliant on their loans and investments were subtly guided, their strategic options constrained or enabled by the financial flows controlled by these families. Industrial output, from weapons to ships to airplanes, was no longer just a measure of national capability, it became a reflection of who controlled the money behind it. In 1961, President Dwight D. Eisenhower famously warned of the military-industrial complex, highlighting the structural entanglement of politics, defense contractors, and long-term fiscal policy. This was a modern echo of centuries-old strategies: control the capital, influence the decisions, and guide the outcomes without ever marching into battle. Today, the United States accounts for roughly 40% of global arms exports, contributing to annual military spending exceeding $2 trillion. Much like the Fuggers, Rothschilds, and Krupps before them, modern institutions leverage financial power to shape national security priorities, industrial growth, and global geopolitics. Consider this: the trillion-dollar defense budget. Multinational arms manufacturers and global banks don't operate in isolation. They are part of a system where decisions are made not solely on strategy or ideology, but on the flow of capital. Funding, credit, and financial influence dictate which nations can sustain prolonged conflict, which projects are prioritized, and who emerges as a dominant global power. In other words, history's lesson is unchanged: control the money, and you control the world. Yet this story isn't just about the past. Understanding these dynamics equips us to read today's financial and political world. Modern finance, defense spending, and even international aid are structured around centuries-old principles. Incentives drive markets, and wealth can shape entire societies, even wars, without a single shot being fired. By studying these historical patterns, we see that money has always been the hidden engine of power, silently guiding human events, shaping nations, and rewriting the rules of global influence. So, the next time you think about wars, empires, or even economic crises, remember this: behind every headline, every treaty, every battlefield victory, there is often a network of financiers, industrialists, and strategic thinkers whose impact surpasses the general's swords and the soldier's guns. The history of money is the history of power, and the families who mastered it wrote the rules of the modern world. History may remember the generals and the kings, but it was the financiers, the industrial dynasties, and the invisible hands of wealth that controlled the true outcomes of nations. From the Renaissance to today's military-industrial complex, the principle remains unchanged: money is power, and those who understand it shape the world.